Okay, so welcome back. We are now moving forward to our last presentation. I'll introduce the two speakers of this last presentation. I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Elspeth Jones, who is a Emerita Professor of the Internationalization of Higher Education at Leeds Beckett University and founding editor of the Routledge series Internationalization in Higher Education. She has been a pioneer in promoting inclusive internationalization with key interests in curriculum design, intercultural learning, and the role of languages. She has worked with universities and organizations across 6 continents, including UNESCO, the European Commission, and the British Council. And her contributions have been recognized with the EAEI Award, inaugural award for excellence in research, and the Noam Chomsky Global Connections Lifetime Achievement Medal. Also, I'm also pleased to introduce Giorgio Marinoni, Manager for Higher Education and Internationalization at the International Association of Universities since 2015, where he leads internationalization as a strategic priority. He coordinates the Higher Education Internationalization Advisory Services and recently led the 6th Global Survey on Internationalization of Higher Education. He also coordinates the network of international education associations and is a working group leader in the European Network on International Student Mobility. So please welcome both of our speakers. Hans, thank you.
Thank you very much, Orlando, and thank you to EDULOG for inviting us, and we're very happy to be here. We've never presented together before. This is a new experiment for us, and we're hoping to do this in a little bit more like a dialogue. This is why we're not standing at the podium. We're wanting to kind of present in a slightly different way. Although we do have to change the slides, Giorgio.
Yeah.
So one of us needs to do this.
You start because you are the first one introducing this nice conversation, but then I would be happy also to do that.
Okay. Well, first of all, we've been asked to talk about a new roadmap for internationalization. And I think Hans's presentation just now was really helpful in outlining really the full range of internationalization. So we know that the conference is focusing on international students, but we want to be thinking perhaps a little bit more broadly about internationalization, following on, as I say, from what Hans has said, but also yesterday's presentations as well, because there was a lot of diversity. And I think particularly from Hans's presentation, people will have recognized that the idea of a single roadmap for internationalization is not really possible because, as he said, the context is so important. Whether it's the university, whether it's the country, the regional impulse or the global requirements, that everything is very different according to which university you're in. So the idea of a single roadmap for internationalization isn't really possible. What we're going to try and do, though, is to think about, beyond those kind of local contexts, to think about some of the shared themes. And we're going to hopefully talk about that in general a little bit, but also then Giorgio is going to talk about his particular research in terms of the IAU Global Survey. So hopefully it's going to be of interest, what we have to say. So as has been very clearly presented throughout the conference so far, the geopolitical tensions are increasing all the time. We don't seem to be seeing very much good news at the moment, do we? And that nationalism being on the rise, the security, the knowledge security, and the way those concepts are changing, as Hans has said, that what we thought of as responsible internationalization, perhaps we have a very, very different impression of that than those people in governments who are worried about our research being used for nefarious practices or being sought out by other governments. So responsible internationalization and various other concepts are changing their meaning. And that increased role of governments in higher education and what they're saying about how universities should operate. And probably we saw yesterday, as Hans mentioned, that Harvard University has been told they can't recruit any more international students. Well, it's up to the institution to recruit the international students, but if the government won't give them visas to come in, then the government is in control. So the role of governments is really important in all of this. So what we tried to do is to think about some of the key themes, and if we are moving forward with the shared themes towards a sort of roadmap for internationalization, we think these are the sort of 5 key areas that we might want to talk about. So mobility's been on as we've been discussing all the time so far. We're going to talk a little bit more about curriculum, what we mean by curriculum internationalization. We're going to talk a bit more about partnerships and research and internationalization and society. So we're going to really try and look at those 5 themes. So I mentioned the survey. I don't know how many people are familiar with the IAU's global survey of institutions, which this is the 6th iteration of it, and obviously that's very interesting because we've been able to see the progress over the years of the different results from around the world. And obviously, Giorgio is going to talk a lot more about that. So briefly, it's an institutional survey, and there's only 1 response allowed per institution. But this time, there was 722 higher education institutions which responded in 110 countries and territories around the world. So that's, it's a big reflective survey. Very important for us to learn from, those of us who are in the field. And this gives a sufficient number of responses for some sort of statistically relevant analysis at global and regional levels. So it's actually very important. So 6 world regions are included. The report's freely available on the IAU website, and we're going to look into that in a bit more detail, beginning with mobility.
Thank you very much, Elspeth, for this very general introduction. As just Elspeth said, we are going to look specifically at some of the areas of internationalization, and we start with one which is, I would say, particularly important for the theme of this conference because it's mobility. And as we heard already, there are different types of mobility. Hans said it very clearly in the previous presentation. We cannot speak about any international student. There are different types of international students. And here in today's presentation, we decided to focus on 2 types of mobility, the degree mobility and the credit mobility, and try to understand what's happening right now, nowadays, in these 2 types of mobilities, and what could happen in the future. Hans already said it in his presentation. There are tensions at the moment. There are even contrasting rationales, especially in countries in the global north, because we have on one hand we have nationalism and protectionism, but on the other hand we still have this economic demand and also demographic decline that are calling for an increase in mobility. So what could happen in degree mobility? One thing that could happen is that the numbers will decrease globally, but personally I don't believe that it's what's going to happen. What is going to happen probably is that there will be a change of balance of fluxes of mobility, not anymore so much from east to west and south to north, but maybe a distribution with the emergence of new poles of attraction. What happens instead for credit mobility? I mean, the tensions are a little bit similar. We still have the nationalism. We also have financial cuts that they can reduce, for instance, grants for credit mobility. And again here, what can happen? It can happen again that there will be a decrease on the overall number of credit mobility students. But again, it could happen that there is a what I call it a clusterization, so that people will continue to be mobile credit-wise, but not anymore on a global scale, but on island of friendly country where they will move among those countries, but not with competitors or even worse, unfriendly country. So this could have also a similar effect to what we see already, which is the regionalization effect that we will speak a little bit more later on. And last but not the least, we heard a lot about this type of mobility yesterday from the very nice presentation of Yashar, is forced or coerced mobility. I will not say again what Yashar said, but one point that I want to highlight here is that if we look by region of the world, we see that the amount of refugees is different, and especially here what I want to underline is Sub-Saharan Africa is the region of the world that has the highest number of refugees, both in terms of where the refugees are coming from and where the refugees are going, because the refugees are not crossing an ocean. At the first step, they go to the neighboring countries. And this is something very important because, and here I will present the first result from the survey, if I manage to change the slide. Okay. So here I will present the first result of the survey, because in the survey we ask if higher education institutions have measures in place to help the refugees and the migrants. And here you can see, divided by region, the percentage of higher education institutions that do have that type of measures. And you see that while in Europe, 64% of higher education institutions have those measures, in Sub-Saharan Africa, they are only 30%. So in a way, higher education institutions are not ready to support the refugees and the migrant students. This is like a very short introduction on the theme of mobility, but now I would like to give back the floor to you, Elspeth, to speak a little bit about the curriculum.
Yes, thank you. I just think it's important for us to think about these slides on mobility, though, because I was really surprised when we talked about this presentation, that the amount of mobility within a small region is actually really substantial, because I think if you live in a country in Western Europe, you might think that, you know, all the refugees are heading to the West. And I think these slides are really important for us to be aware of. And just, if I just might briefly go back to that previous slide, I think it's quite evident from this. As you say, Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest number of migrants out, and they also have the highest number of migrants in, so immigrants as well. And that Middle East and North Africa is the second in both cases, and Asia and Pacific's the third region of origin, but Europe is the third region of asylum. And this is not necessarily the story that some of our right-wing governments in particular, some of our right-wing politicians are trying to explain to us. They take the figures in the wrong way, I think. So I think this is really important. And I think it also has, it then has implications also for curriculum. I want to, we've talked about internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum. Both of these terms have been used during yesterday's and today's presentations. I think I should say at this point that I think they're effectively the same thing. So let us not try and make a big distinction between curriculum and internationalization at home. They came from different origins. Internationalization of the curriculum was largely begun in Australia. Betty Lesk is the prime mover and the global leader in understanding internationalization of the curriculum. And it was also used a lot in the UK. So Australia and the UK work very closely together in some respects on internationalization. But in Western Europe, in Europe in general, quite often the mobility, the internationalization with institutions was coming from international offices, whereas in Australia and the UK, the internationalization was coming through the curriculum by academics. So it's partly that the origins were either more based around academics and the others were more around international offices. Now, it's not normally the case, it's not always the case anyway, shall we say, that international officers are very familiar with curriculum and what does curriculum mean. And Betty Lesk's definition of internationalization of the curriculum makes it clear that it's not simply the syllabus, it's not simply what am I teaching in the classroom, but it's about the content of the course, it's about the preparation for the course, it's about the support staff, the people who are surrounding the program. So it's a much broader concept than simply just what am I going to teach in my classroom. And so the concept of internationalization at home was really, as Hans said this morning, it was a contrast to the idea of mobility, but what it hasn't done, and I feel guilty about this because I wrote a definition of internationalization at home with my colleague Jos Belen, and that's kind of muddied the waters to some extent. Really, it's effectively the same thing. So in terms of curriculum, again, the survey's got interesting things to talk to us about. And they've said that the respondents to the survey, the vast majority of them have shown an increasing interest. As I said, we've been able to look over the years of the survey, but in the last 5 years even, they've shown increasing importance of internationalizing the curriculum at home. And I think probably prompted to some degree by the COVID pandemic, we've seen a lot more online activities to help develop international perspectives of students who do not get the opportunity to travel. So virtual exchanges, COIL, collaborative online international learning, online collaborative international projects, and virtual internships, virtual exchange, these have all increased a lot. And it's very helpful to be able to see from the survey that it's in all regions of the world that this has happened. Things started, these things probably were prompted, and well, not necessarily prompted, but increasingly developed through the COVID years, the pandemic years when students weren't able to travel. And I guess we had optimism. Certainly I know Hans has written about this, the optimism of that this might actually change the way we viewed internationalization, that we might focus much more on what was happening in the home context. But in fact, pretty much as he predicted, as soon as the pandemic was over, we're focusing again on mobility. And although these are growing in importance, we're still looking very much at international mobility as a prime focus for internationalization. So the survey also shows then that the Asia Pacific, North Africa and the Middle East are the most advanced regions in looking at those institution-wide, international, intercultural, global learning outcomes, graduate capabilities, but they have different approaches at the institutional or national levels, which actually is a very good thing, and it's partly what Hans was talking about this morning. And interestingly, that North America has the least development of those learning outcomes. So global learning outcomes or internationalized learning outcomes are the things which will help us to internationalize the curriculum. And it seems that North America is not necessarily focusing so much on those, which is quite interesting. But then there isn't the kind of national accreditation agency or the national initiatives around curriculum and so on, which you find in some other countries. So in a way, it might not be too surprising. But so the next theme that we wanted to talk about, the third theme, is partnerships. And I'm going to pass back to Giorgio on this one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Elspeth. Of course, partnership is a very important part of internationalization because basically a lot of the other activities are done through partnership. So if we want to have mobility, we want to have student mobility, usually we do it also through partnership. We want to exchange student mobility, credit mobility, we do through partnership. If you want to collaborate in internationalization of research, that will be the next topic that Elspeth will speak about, it is also done through partnership. So it is important to understand how partnerships are evolving in the world. And as Elspeth also mentioned, there was the COVID-19 pandemic. Please remember that the result of the survey was conducted in 2023, so it's 2 years old now. So already in 2 years there are new developments, what we have discussed before. So maybe the geopolitical tensions were already visible a bit in this, in the result of the survey, but if we are doing the survey, if we were to do the survey this year, maybe the result might be a little bit different. So this, I think, is something important to remember. I will speak a little bit more about partnership also from a qualitative point of view, because after the global survey, we also conducted a follow-up project on qualitative research. So we look at some results of the survey, and among them there was exactly partnership. And we did some interviews with the same institution that replied to the survey to understand better what is the evolution in this sense. And the first result that I want to show you here is that the number of partnership has increased at the majority of higher education institutions in all regions of the world over the last 5 years. Okay, so the years they go from 2018 to 2023. And the second point this was not something taken for granted because there was the COVID pandemic in between. So it might have been that some partnership would have been cancelled, but that's not the case. Also because we see here from these results, the fact that the number of partnerships have increased is not really due to the COVID-19 pandemic in the majority of the regions. There is a bit of difference between regions. If you see here, for instance, Europe, you have a clear majority that say that's absolutely not the case. It's not due to COVID-19. But if we move to Latin America or to Sub-Saharan Africa, then we have a substantial percentage of institutions that they say that the COVID-19 pandemic, in a way, was beneficial for partnership. So it led them to create more partnership. And this might be linked to what you were saying before about the development of online cooperation. Of course, this we cannot see it from the result of the survey, but it could be a possible explanation. And I was mentioning here the other qualitative project that we did, that I just mentioned. And what are we seeing in terms of partnership from this qualitative research? So we are seeing some changing aspects in the partnership. So we see, and this for me is a positive evolution, that the traditional objective of creating partnership for prestige is less important. It seems that it is becoming more important to create partnerships that are equal, that are mutual beneficial, and that are also complementary. And this is, for me, is a very positive development. As is a positive development, the other thing that we are seeing, that higher education institutions are not focusing anymore just on the traditional partners, usually based in the global north Anglo-Saxon countries, but they are looking for a more diverse spectrum of partners. What are the criteria, all the new criteria in developing partnership that we see? Geopolitical consideration, and this one probably is less positive as a development. Student needs, and this is a very important and I would say very positive development, but also effective resource management. So institutions have to live with restrained budget, with restrained human resources, so they have to see also through partnership what they can do. And here I will not really read, but I have 2 slides that are illustrating what I have just said, and they are from institutions based in different regions of the world. So this here is from Canada. So here is illustrating the fact that they are switching from their traditional partners towards partners more in the global south. Here it's an institution from Oman, and here it's really stressing the mutual benefit. They even say that they are not doing a David and Goliath partnership, but they're really looking for a partnership that is mutual beneficial and where collaboration can really bring positive results for the partners. And here instead we see another Canadian institution that is saying pretty clearly the effect of geopolitical changes and especially the interference of governments. They're saying research security is a big issue in Canada. So there are restrictions. So there is a big intervention of government on the way that and with whom they can partner. And last but not the least, here is interesting, is an Australian AI they are saying why they are partnering, why they're doing partnership. And they are doing partnership because this allows them to do something they would not be able to do on their own. So this international cooperation it might be also something related that is an Australian institution, so Australia is located somehow far away, but the international cooperation allows them to do something that alone they could not do. And speaking about geography, I think a very interesting result, this is one of my favorite results actually of all the results in the global survey, is the result about geographic priorities. So we ask higher education institutions if they have defined geographic priorities for internationalization as a whole. And as you can see, about 60% of institutions have defined those geographic priorities. And in this graph, you will see the level of priority that is given to each region by higher education institution. And as you can see, Europe stands out as the priority region. However, we have to pay attention when we are looking at data, as we were looking also yesterday with the presentation of Simon. Data are not telling everything. You need to interpret data. So here, for instance, we have to remember how is the distribution of higher education institutions that reply to our survey. Majority of them are coming from Europe. So these global results are, yes, interesting, but it would be much better to analyze the results divided by region. So to look at how each region have replied to this question. And here we see very interesting trends, because we see, in fact, that the fact that Europe was the first in the previous graph is because 90% of higher education institutions from Europe are saying that the priority region is Europe. So there is a clear regionalization trend in Europe. This is not a surprise. There is the Bologna process, there is the European higher education area. But what is more interesting for me is that this regionalization trend, it's not simply a European thing. There is a trend, a similar trend in Asia Pacific, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and even in Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, it's not as developed as is in Europe. Of course, it's something new, but the institution consider this regionalization a priority. On the contrary, it's not a priority in North America, in North Africa and the Middle East, and absolutely not a priority in North America. North America are only 2 countries, but collaborating between the US and Canada, no, that's...
Or maybe the 51st state will make that change,
maybe,
yes.
But... Okay, another one which we analyze is the same table. We are just looking at different things. We ask ourselves, what about the global north and global south? I'm not a big fan of this division of global north and global south, but we have to recognize that there is, unfortunately, an inequality out in the world. So we were looking in a very approximate way, I have to say, this kind of collaboration between global north and global south. Why I'm saying approximate way? Because we said Europe is global north, North America is global north, and the rest we consider it as global south. I would be the first one to question this division. Okay? Because in Asia and Pacific, there are a lot of countries that I will put in the global north and not in the global south. But at least this is giving us a rough idea. And the rough idea is very interesting because it shows that institutions in the global south, basically, they partnering with other institutions in the global south outside their region, it's definitely not a priority. So unfortunately, and I say it unfortunately, still institutions in the global south are looking at the global north. But the opposite, it's not true. The institutions in the global north are not looking in the global south. And this, I think, it's a very interesting result, and I will give the floor to Elspeth back, because this might have interesting implications for internationalization of research.
Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of research, it is interesting. So a few years ago, Hans and I, along with Nico Joosten from South Africa and Jocelyn Gasalavila from Mexico, France and Mexico, we tried to look at, in a book, we tried to get people from different global regions of the world to articulate what internationalization meant for them. And unfortunately, there is still, I think, too much of a tendency to look at the global north and the way that countries in Europe are dealing with internationalization or working on it. And there is not always enough localization of a different approach to internationalization. But as we know, some of us have been in this business for a long time, and I think the priorities for research have changed to some extent. And we need to think about where it's going to go next, I suppose. I think one of the things that's changed a lot is that there's been much more research into internationalization itself. So, as Hans mentioned this morning, in the early days, we didn't really articulate that very much, and there wasn't the research into what was being done around internationalization. So, over the 30 years that I've been involved, or 40 years that Hans has been involved, or it has changed. The emphasis is much greater, and there's more detail in the research in internationalization itself. And we're seeing a trend also to looking at, and Sylvie didn't really talk about this yesterday because she had a different remit, but the work they're doing in Manchester, for example, or leading, shall I say, the work that they're leading in Manchester around research with international students rather than research on international students or about international students, I think is really quite groundbreaking. And if you're interested in looking at research with international students, there's a fantastic, they've got a really good online presence, they've got lots of things on there, and it's really worth looking at. And there's quite a community now, I think, spanning the globe, really, who are looking at research with international students. But what about the future? And are things going to carry on in this way? So we've got two possible scenarios. One is more pessimistic and one is more optimistic, I guess. As Hans said, the challenge of the COVID pandemic brought universities together to work together, but has that continued? So in this pessimistic scenario, we see more of a fragmentation. We see more of creation of islands or clusters of higher education institutions in friendly countries. So this is the pessimistic scenario, remember, it may or may not happen. We might see increased competition, depending on geopolitics, but also funding and government priorities and whatever, so we might see a lot more competition. That would mean a multiplication of efforts and fewer synergies, and making it more difficult to tackle the global challenges. Now, we've seen a lot of evidence of universities working together to do research and to try and look towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. But in this pessimistic scenario, perhaps that might not be such a priority going forward. And then the increased inequality in research, partly due to funding or due to government interest or government directives, as has been mentioned already. So that potential for increased inequality, and not least because in a way that there could be a continuation of dependency on, for example, global South countries needing global North countries to fit them into or support them into applying for research funding, which is dependent on region. So that's the pessimistic scenario. But if we're trying to be more optimistic, the global challenges that we're facing now, the climate crisis, the Sustainable Development Goals, whatever, we still need global solutions. And the global cooperation in our optimistic scenario will survive those tensions and what we've been seeing currently. But the other possibility is that we might get this new ways, shall we say, of collaboration through a shifting away from a neoliberal market approach. Now, well, we'll see whether that happens, but I think even Hans was quite optimistic about that this morning to some degree. And perhaps we will be thinking more about new ways of research cooperation, thinking about using the opportunities through open access publishing, and the way that research careers are being recognized much more effectively for international collaboration. We know that internationally co-authored articles are more frequently cited. So there are other things that are drawing towards international collaboration and internationalization of research. Thinking about how those marginalized voices, shall we say, the voices that have less traditionally been included in some of our research endeavors, how that might lead to greater inclusion. and hopefully less inequality. So, you know, maybe the actual answer is somewhere between the two. But, you know, that's what we felt we'd outlined in terms of pessimistic or optimistic scenarios. The next thing we wanted to look at, the last of our 5 areas, is internationalization and society. And again, this has been mentioned already. I think Hans and I and Betty Lesk and Uwe Brandenburg have written about internationalization of higher education for society, which is kind of ironic, really, because we're all from the global north and the not necessarily Anglo, but certainly Western European perspectives, as it were, Western Anglo perspectives. And actually, internationalization and society, I think, is probably, perhaps even Latin America, is the prime example of this being completely embedded into what universities do. So it was very interesting to look at this and to research into that. So society, the influence of internationalization on society, with society, is very important. And I think the universities have this third mission, the mission, so teaching, research, and working with society, and being with, having a local and national contribution to make is important. I think equally it needs to fit very much with with some other agendas, as Hans kindly cited an article that I wrote. We need to be thinking about how equality, diversity and inclusion fits with internationalization, how, you know, using internationalization to help challenge racism and xenophobia, how to promote intercultural understanding, I think is really important. And the evidence from the survey suggests that EDI, for example, is being taken into account at 80% or more of all regions in the world. However, the target group differs by region. And I also wonder, since the survey was done, whether EDI in North America has the same situation since the recent election. But obviously, that remains to be seen. But what's interesting is that equality, diversity and inclusion, across Europe, people with disabilities are in focus there, in 73% of HEIs. In North Africa and the Middle East, 64%, but it's also important in sub-Saharan Africa. So the idea of equity, diversity and inclusion for people with disabilities. Low socioeconomic background is the most important target group in Latin America and the Caribbean. But it's also important in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and Pacific. And ethnic and cultural minorities are an important target group in North America, or were, but less important in any other region. Now, whether that means that in other regions they're more included already or not, I don't know. So there's it's interesting. The majority of respondents also indicated that internationalization had a positive effect on intercultural understanding and challenging racism and xenophobia, both within their institutions and in society as a whole. So it is very interesting to think about how that might work. And Giorgio is going to look at the next slide.
Yes, thank you, Elspeth. I might just add one important point, I think, that also connects with Hans said in his presentation from this data that Elspeth just presented, which is sometimes we think we are speaking the same language, but in reality we are not. And I even have a practical case. In the previous project that I mentioned, the qualitative project, there was a question on EDI. I didn't have the time to present it here, but the question was, are you doing something in EDI? And then they said, no, we're not doing anything in EDI in our institution. But we are doing a lot of measures for people from socio-economic backgrounds. Okay, so. So again, on the linkage between community and between internationalization and community engagement or societal engagement, depending on how you would like to call this aspect of the third mission of universities. Here we can see an interesting result that 60% of higher education institutions claim that they are linking indeed internationalization and their third mission. But here maybe we are going a little bit in the direction of what Hans was saying before, that it's more rhetoric than reality, because when we ask if they are measuring the impact of their actions, we see that in basically all regions, there is not much impact conducted. And here again, I think it's a very interesting case. It's Sub-Saharan Africa, because it's at the same time the region where the linkage is the lower, but also where the impact measurement is the highest. So we see a very polarized region. So there are some higher education institutions that are very advanced and some others that are less. Whereas if you see Europe, it's more balanced. And now I think we presented all the 5 dimensions of internationalization. So we still have something like 20 minutes to really look ahead. And I would like to start with even more this dialogue with Elspeth to ask you, what do you think are the major themes when we are looking ahead?
Okay, so we decided that we thought we would talk about these. We're not going to talk for another 20 minutes, though, are we, Giorgio? No, we're going to give the opportunity for discussion. But I think the thing, the looking ahead thing, I think people, it looks as though that there are a number of priorities, as we said at the beginning, that are perhaps coalescing around the idea of internationalization going forward. So the link with from internationalization, internationalized curriculum to other agendas. We mentioned EDI. There are other aspects of that which we can think about. So many universities are looking at decolonizing the curriculum, for example. We've talked about diversity and inclusion, and are we thinking more broadly about what internationalization really means in that respect? So Hans said that he and I agree that internationalization is not necessarily the best word, it's just that nobody's come up with a better one. But I think the problem is that we understand so much within the concept of internationalization that it becomes nothing, as he said. It loses its focus. And as he said, I've used, in some of my writing, I've used this term interculturalization, because those definitions which talk about, going back to the Jane Knight definition of 93, looking at adding an intercultural, an international, and a global perspective to higher education. We've focused a lot on the international, but actually I think we need to focus much more on the intercultural, because whatever we're talking about internationally, if we're talking about working with people from other cultures and other countries and other backgrounds, if we are good at doing that in terms of other nations and other peoples around the world, then we need to think also, how is that helping us at home? The transferable skills, working towards the people that we live and work with and see in society. Basically, the skills are transferable to the domestic environment as much as they are to the international environment. So I think we should focus much, much more on the intercultural and less on the international, because then we will see the value to everybody in society of being better at working together, at living together, and that's sort of humane side of what we've called so far internationalization. So I think that's really, really important, and having the link with decolonization of the curriculum, the link with equity, diversity and inclusion, the link with any kind of promotion of access to university and helping more people to come to university is very, very important. So it fits with other agendas which are already within higher education institutions. So, Giorgio, let me ask you, how do you think sustainability is going to go forward from where you've been?
Yeah, thank you very much, Elspeth. I think this issue of sustainability, it's a very complex one. First of all, what do we mean when we speak about sustainability? Because when we speak about sustainability, we can even mean two completely different things. We can mean sustainability means that what we are doing now, we will do it in 5, 10, 100 years. Or it means that what we are doing has a positive impact for the planet. So in this case, sustainability are two different things. And there are a lot of movement now in the international education of realizing the possible negative impact of what we are doing, of our action on especially the climate. And there were some action, we didn't put it in the slide, but you might have heard about, for instance, the CANI network of internationalization, respectful internationalization for climate action
network
in
for international education.
Education.
Yeah.
So there is a movement that is really taking into account the positive negative effect and try to mitigate the positive negative effect for the planet and for climate protection. However, sustainable development, as defined by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, climate action is a very important one, but it's just one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And sustainable development, it's a much broader topic, a much broader issue. And we also have to realize that we cannot have climate action completely separated by the other effects. For instance, if we don't have peace and if we are throwing bombs at each other, I don't think we will be ever able to protect the climate. So if we have anger and people don't have food, I don't think our climate will benefit. And an interesting result that I want to show from the survey, so here maybe we just skip one slide and we go here. We asked to higher education institution how they link internationalization and sustainable development. Do they link it? And if they link it, how they link it? So they don't link it at all, like half of the institution in North America. So these are two separate concepts. They link it only in terms of climate protection. These are the red bars. They link it also beyond climate protection. So they take this more holistic view of sustainable development, but they do it on an ad hoc base without really a strategy for it. Or they link it really with a strategy that internationalization is seen as a means to achieve sustainable development in its broader definition of the Sustainable Development Goal and Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. And here what I think is very interesting is to see how, if we move from one region to the other, the results are very different. So we go from North America, where half of the institutions are not linking at all these two concepts, to Asian Pacific, where half of the institutions are really saying that internationalization is a tool to achieve sustainable development. And now I would like to give you back the floor, Elspeth, to maybe speak a little bit more on this challenge between competition and collaboration.
Yeah, just very briefly, because I think we're running out of time a little bit, but I think we've talked about a lot about this, and Hans has really focused on that this morning. So I think the challenge of talent versus brain drain, you know, what's the priority and how is that going to work? Are we talking about the financial imperative as the question of the conference asks us, or are we talking about future citizens, people who are planning to migrate? We've covered a lot of these areas here, the changing nature of branch campuses and transnational education. But on the other hand, we're looking at collaboration, obviously research, obviously teaching, obviously partnerships and exchanges and so on. But also, I think we forget the opportunities for benchmarking our practice against what's happening in other countries. And the IAU survey is one way that we can use to look at that, to see what we're doing and how does that compare everywhere else. So that vital need for collaboration and cooperation, as we've said, is absolutely crucial. And so I think the regionalisation aspect of it, the thing that perhaps we've not covered in quite as much detail, the European University Alliances, the initiative there has been very interesting. And there's the emphasis, I guess you're familiar with the idea of a European degree. Whether that's a good idea or not remains to be seen. But also this is happening in other regions as well. So for example, the ASEAN countries are following in terms of credit transfer and so on. Well, Hans and I have said that regionalisation may increase in importance in the face of parochialism and nationalism, and I think that's partly what you were saying earlier, Giorgio. You called it clusterisation, and I think we'll see whether that is important or not. So finally, we've just got a few final thoughts. So that importance of collecting data by whatever means, whether it's OECD data, whether it's IAU survey data, and trying to mean the same thing. When we use a word, does it mean the same wherever we're using it, whether it's a definition of an international student or what we mean by equality, diversity and inclusion. So being aware amongst ourselves of what's happening in other parts of the world and enhancing practice and so on is absolutely crucial. Contextualizing our own practice, but also ownership of internationalization and what it means for my university, in my country, in my part of the world, and actually, more importantly, within that for academics, what does it mean in my discipline? What does it mean for my subject area within this context as well? And so the role of internationalization and societal responsibility, which we've mentioned before. So it's not a roadmap, but I guess we've tried to point to some aspects of direction, and I hope that's been of use. Thank you very much, Giorgio.
Thank you very much, Elspeth. I think we have talked too much among each other now.
We have.
And now it's time to talk with you.
We've got the references there.
So thank you both for this very dynamic and interesting presentation. In fact, I don't know if you are pessimistic or an optimistic regarding it was not completely clear. It depends also what will happen in the future. But now I will open the floor to the audience. Questions, comments, please.
Okay, working. So first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed this presentation. It gave me a lot of food for thought. I'm gonna think about it. But one thing that came to mind was so after these two great presentations. So by now we all realize we live in a dynamic world. So do you think it makes sense to still narrow and give a direction to the definition of internationalization? Because, so we have a definition that it's now in contradiction with the reality. And my second thing is more of a consideration, but it's also, I would also like to know your opinion on this, is that so maybe regionalization, so maybe I'm being optimistic, but I think that internationalization, it's also a tool that enabled us, or maybe it's the consequence of having an open mind. I don't know if it's the cause or the consequence of having an open mind to the world, to globalization issues. Maybe I'm not sure optimistic or pessimistic. I don't think we can stop globalization. Maybe we can turn it into regionalization, but I don't think we can stop the movement. I really want to believe that we can still work the same way we did 10 years ago, but I'd like to know your thoughts on this. So basically the two questions is first, does it make sense to give a direction to the definition of internationalization? Second, do you think that internationalization can be stopped or turned into regionalization, basically?
If you take that second one.
I take the second
I'll take the first one. Okay. In terms of definitions, I think Hans and I would be in agreement that we don't really need any more definitions. We spend too much time thinking about a definition which can both close. It helps sometimes to direct some of the things that we're doing, but it sometimes closes our thoughts to other things. So the word international, as I've tried to explain there, is in itself closing our mind to more things which are actually more part of society as a whole. So I don't think we need any more definitions. Having said that, people love definitions, and there seems to be a need. Every time anybody writes an article, they've always got to cite, Hans's definition of internationalization. My definition with Jos on internationalization at home is my most cited article. I wish people would just stop defining things and actually do things. You know, we need to actually get on and practice what we preach, as has been said a number of times. So we need to just actually get on and do things rather than just carry on defining things more and more specifically.
Yeah, on the second part, I would reply with two different answers. The first one, you're asking if it's possible to stop internationalization and move to regionalization or even stop it altogether. Is it possible? Yeah, unfortunately, yes, it is possible. Is that the way we should do? Personally, no, I don't think so. So we have to be conscious on one end, because it could happen, but that will not be the way to go, because yeah, we can close, we can only look at our neighbors, we can only look at ourselves, but the problems that are outside in the world that are global by nature will not disappear, will only get worse in this way. So we will still have those challenges to face, and if we go that way, we will make them even worse. And we will not solve anything. The second point that you raise is, can we go on doing what we were doing before, what we were doing 10 years ago? Then I would disagree that we can go on doing what we were doing 10 years ago, but not because this specific situation. In any case, you cannot do what you were doing 10 years before. You always have to evolve because the world evolved. Can we keep our values that we had 10 years ago? Yes, of course we can. Not only we can, but now that these values are challenged, we should even keep them and defend them even more.
Yeah.
Yeah, great answer. Okay, more questions or comments? Okay, there. Here.
I saw.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joana Filhol. I work in the Internationalization unit at the Faculty of Nutrition and Food Sciences here at the University of Porto. And thank you very much for this conference. It was very interesting to be here, because I started working in this area just 1 month ago, so it's very interesting to have this perspective. It was fantastic. I would like to ask you what people who research in this area would advise people who are in the internationalization units at the faculties to do. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. What research we would ask you to do?
No, what do you advise us to do? We work with the international students in internationalization units. What do you think we should do? What would be your priority if you work there?
In terms of practice.
In terms of practice, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'll start because I'm going to just mention curriculum. So I think one of the things is that very often people who work in international offices spot things during their normal work. They will see people from other countries or partners, or they'll come into contact with people who are working in promoting the institution. And I think one of the things that can be looked at is where, what direction are other universities going in? What kind of subjects would be of interest to my students? How should our curriculum develop? So I think that keeping an eye on what's happening in the rest of the world is really very important, and encouraging the academics that you're working with to really think about what international and particularly intercultural dimensions mean for their subject areas. It's got to be done at subject level. So if you're working with, I'm not sure how extensive your role is, but if you're working across a faculty, there'll be a range of different subject areas who will all have different views on starting with what does a graduate from my subject area look like? What do they need to know about in terms of international and intercultural competencies or transferable skills? So starting at the end point of what does a graduate look like, how can we then internationalize different aspects of the curriculum with that end result in mind? So looking across partnerships, looking across other institutions, that benchmarking I mentioned, but also then helping to feed into curriculum with the academics. It's a kind of a an interesting crossroads of a role. It can be helpful in both ways, I think, as well as talking to the students, obviously, and working with them.
Yeah, just one thing I would like to add to what Elspeth said that I completely agree with. The most important thing is that you start meet and talk among yourself. And I think this is what we are doing, for instance, in the ENIST network, is exactly that. Try to bridge this gap that unfortunately sometimes exists, even inside the same institution. You have researchers that are studying the topic of internationalization, then you have the international office, they don't know that, what the other is doing. Then just start to talk with each other and try to understand what are the reciprocal needs, and that will be very beneficial for both.
Yes. We will take one more question. Hans, please.
Well, no.
Haven't you said enough?
No, in the sideline, you mentioned the European University Alliances, and it is indeed surprising that we have not talked much about it in the past presentations. But if you look at the optimistic or the pessimistic scenario of your future, what is your perspective on the European University Alliances? Are they the changing paradigm for internationalization in the European context or not?
It's a very interesting question. I must put my cards on the table. I'm on an advisory board for one of the alliances, and so I've seen it from the inside, as well as obviously trying to keep abreast of what's happening elsewhere. I think there's some really interesting work actually going on. On the frustrating side from my perspective is that on the board we are in a way complying with European the EU requirements to give feedback and to report on this, that and the other. So we get involved in some really boring things, I have to be honest, in terms of what the reports look like and how do we have to send this back. Actually, when we look at some of the developments that have taken place, I'm talking particularly about the one that I'm involved with, they've done some fantastic work, and they're working with some partners that they had originally, but because of the changing nature of the requirements to add other partners in, so I think we began with 6, and I think they've now got 9 partners involved in the alliance, and there have been some really interesting developments, and I think the curriculum, in terms of jointly devised curriculum, has worked well, and I think mobility around the alliance is beginning to work really well. And so the one that I was involved with was part of the first tranche as well as the second. So I think some things are working very well, and I think it's helped people to engage with institutions in parts of the world that perhaps they might not have otherwise thought about. So you talked when you were talking about partnerships. One of the things that perhaps just thinking about the European context, there's always been a tendency for Western European nations to partner with other Western European nations. But one thing that's been really interesting in the alliance that I've been involved with is the partnership with universities from the former Eastern Bloc in some cases, and Eastern universities in general. And I think it's brought a whole new series of perspectives on some of the work that they've done. So I can't speak for all of them, but I think there have been some really positive things. I'm less sure about the European degree. I don't know how that's going to work, but have you got anything else to say on that?
No, I agree with you, Elspeth. I think to summarize it, to reply to your question in a straight way, will they be so revolutionary as they were presented? Will they completely change the landscape of higher education in Europe? Will they achieve the political aim they were created for? Because this is a pure political action that was launched by the President of France, Macron. Then my answer will be no. I don't believe it. I don't think that those objectives will be successful. But I completely agree with Elspeth that they have some positive consequences. They put in motion some collaboration. They even made university thinking on a different way on the way that they are partnering. So I think there will be some legacy of this initiative, even if at a certain point the support of the European Union will vanish. but I don't think it will be so transformative as it might have be envisaged at first stage.
I don't know how it is for all of the partnerships, but the one, as I say, the one I've been involved with, right from the very beginning, they've been trying to transition their thinking into how will this be sustained when we don't have the funding anymore. And so I think if alliances have been thinking in that way for 2, 3, 4 years, they're much more likely to be sustained going forward. I don't know if that's true for all of them, but I think certainly some of them seem to be showing that. So it's an interesting initiative, though. Maybe will be taken up in other parts of the world.
Maybe a thing for our next conference. So thank you so much for your thoughts, for the discussions, and another applause for you.
Thank you.